United States, 1863. Civil War divided the country into two. On the one hand, the Confederates, willing to preserve slavery at any cost. On the other, the Union, which was beginning to march in the name of freedom. In the midst of this conflict, an anonymous man hitherto crossed the lines of war and transformed his pain into a symbol. His name was Gordon, although he was also called Whipped Peter by the soldiers who welcomed him. When he reached the camp of the Union, he brought in his body the marks of slavery, deep scars that crossed his back as rivers of pain. A photographer recorded that image, and for the first time, the whole world saw in a piece of paper the brutality that was once hidden. The photo was not just a portrait, it was denunciation, and it has changed forever the way slavery was seen inside and outside the United States. Stories like Gordon's show that the struggle against slavery was also made of images and testimonies that no one could ignore. If you believe these memories should remain alive, subscribe to the channel and tell me in the comments. For you, what weighs most? Words of books or the strength of an image? The deafening sound of the gunfire and the gunpowder smell mingled in the hot and muffled air of the southern United States in 1863. Amid the chaos of the battles, where the soil was dyed red by the blood of the combatants, an even more cruel and silent conflict unfolded: slavery. Millions of blacks lived trapped by invisible currents of contempt and violence, their lives reduced to simple goods in an inhuman system that insisted on treating them as less than humans. The plantations extended to where the view reached, a green sea interrupted by shadows that moved to the rhythm of whip and shouted orders. The sun punished without mercy, but it was the cold look of the most burned foreman. Men like Thomas Richardson, the 45-year-old foreman, were the tyrants of these fields. Thomas, with his boots always covered with dust and his whip always put, did not hesitate to use violence to maintain order. He laughed at every cry, with every plea for pity, as if the suffering of others were a spectacle for his morbid pleasure. The South Society, with its imposing mansions and luxurious balls, was sustained by slave labor. While aristocrats discussed politics in adorned halls, men, women, and children were torn from their families and forced to work to exhaustion. Names like James Carter, the administrator of a large plantation, were prominent in local societies, frequent attending church on Sundays. However, behind his respectable facade, James told the money earned from sweat and blood, regardless of the screams that echoed from the fields. The Civil War was, for many, a convenient distraction. Under the justification of preserving ways of life or fighting for freedom, men went to the battlefield, while at home, the true carnage continued. The slave system was a well-lubricated machine of oppression, supported by laws that treated human beings as property, devoid of any right or dignity. Gordon, one of many who lived under this yoke, had scars that not only marked his skin, but his soul. Each scam received was a reminder of the systematic cruelty that ruled their lives. However, inside Gordon burned a flame that not even the most severe punishments could erase. He was not just a body to be explored. He was a man, with dreams and hopes suffocated by the yoke of the white man. Around him, others as he whispered stories of freedom, places where slavery did not exist, of a war that perhaps brought the chance of a new life. But any hope was quickly crushed by internal betrayals and the empty promises of freedom that did not materialize. Many of the enslaved saw their efforts frustrated by those who should be allies, but who, out of fear or self-interest, preferred to maintain the status quo. Betrayal was a constant companion, a reminder that freedom was high, often paid with life. Despite this, the spark of hope persisted. The whispers turned into actions, small acts of resistance that challenged the established order. Gordon's escape was more than a simple desire. It was a promise of revenge against a system that stolen to him, but the desire to fight. He planned every detail meticulously, observing the routines of the forefront, the night patrols, waiting for the right time to act. And while the Civil War was playing the country in half, Gordon and so many others dreamed of a different tomorrow. They were the personification of resistance, every little victory one step towards freedom. The path was long and full of danger, but the promise of justice and revenge was a powerful fuel, capable of move mountains and destroy the strongest of the empires. In this scenario of blood and sacrifice, Gordon's photo, displaying the scars of his struggle, would become a symbol of resistance, a portrait that would shock the world, arousing consciousness and inflammating hearts. But before that, he needed to survive the hell of slavery and the cruelty of men who believed his life. And he would do so with the determination of a man who had nothing more to lose, but all to win. The heaven of Louisiana, vast and impassive, witnessed Gordon's birth on a muffled night, marked by the distant sound of thunder that seemed more a omen than a natural phenomenon. Sons of slaves, he and his brothers came to the world chained by a destination they did not choose. The plantation where Gordon grew up was a vast sugarcane ocean, with his sugarcane fields swing like a green sea under the sun. There, each day, it was a battle against tiredness, hunger, and hopelessness. From a very young age, Gordon was forced to understand that his life did not belong to him. He lived under the yoke of a cruel system, where each whip received by a small mistake was a painful reminder of his condition. The mornings began with the hoarse corner of the birds, but soon the shouts of the forefront took over the air, drowning any sound of hope. Thomas Richardson, the foreman whose sincere laugh was sharper than any blade, made sure everyone knew exactly where his place was. Gordon, however, had an indomitable spirit, a fire that burned in his chest since he was a child. He heard the whispered stories about a world beyond the borders of plantation, where men were free and no one needed to bow under the weight of the chains. These stories fed their imagination and courage, planting seeds of revolt in his young soul. So he began to dream of the escape, a dangerous dream that could cost his life. Gordon's escape attempts were many and varied, each more desperate than the previous one. He knew the fields like the lines of his own hand, each hidden trail and each hiding place between the trees. In the quiet of the night, with his heart hammering in his chest, he sneaked into darkness, guided only by the silver light of the moon and the fierce determination to achieve freedom. But always in one way or another was brought back, dragged back to the plantation by those who hunted him like an animal. With each return, the punishments were more severe. Thomas Richardson made a point of wearing Gordon as an example, undressing ladies that left deep marks not only on the skin but in the soul. However, with each blow, Gordon strengthened, his determination solidifying rather than breaking. He knew that one day, somehow, he could. It was during the Civil War, while the country was tearing into a brutal dispute, that Gordon spotted his true opportunity. The rumors that the Union forces were approaching gave new breath to their escape plans. He knew he needed to act quickly before the chance escaped his fingers. With a renewed courage, he began to carefully observe the routines of the forefront, patrol times, and routes that could lead to freedom. The night Gordon finally escaped was a mixture of adrenaline and terror. The sky was loaded with heavy clouds, the rain threatening to fall at any moment. He squandered like a shadow through the fields, his heart beating so loudly that he feared that he could be heard miles away. Each step was calculated, each noise a potential disaster, but he continued, driven by the promise of a life beyond the chains. After hours that seemed eternity, Gordon crossed the lines of the Union. There, he was welcomed not as a fugitive, but as a man in search of freedom. The meeting with the Union troops was a moment of indescribable relief, a glimpse that another type of life was possible. Its scars, marks of a life of suffering, were recorded in a photo that would soon circulate the world, shocking and inflammating hearts. The image of his back, covered with deep scars, would become a powerful symbol of the brutality of slavery and the tireless resistance of a man who refused to accept his fate. Gordon finally was no longer a slave. He was a free man, a survivor. And its history of pain and resilience would echo through generations, reminding everyone that freedom is an inalienable right, conquered with blood, sweat, and courage. The photo that shocked the world was more than a simple image. It was a struggle testimony and a promise that one day all men would be truly free. The muffled noise of war drums echoed from a distance, mixing with the sound of Gordon's own heart, which beaten out of his chest. The moon, a silent Tonello, illuminated his way through the dense tangle of trees and shrubs that formed the jungle of southern Louisiana. Gordon's escape was not just a race for freedom, it was a race for survival, a desperate dance between life and death. The swamps, with their dark and treacherous waters, extended like a relentless barrier, but Gordon did not hesitate. He advanced, his feet sinking into the thick mud, the smell of rottenness and damp life mixing to heavy air. The shadows moved, threatening around them, and the sound of night creatures created a haunting symphony that seemed to mock its determination. He felt the marks on his back burning, every scar a memory of the pain he left behind. Gordon knew he couldn't stop. Every minute lost was an extra chance for his persecutors to reach him. He moved with the agility of a wild animal, instinct and despair guiding his steps. In his mind, he visualized the faces of Thomas Richardson and James Carter, his tormentors, and this fed his determination. He had promised himself that he would not come back, that he would no longer be a slave, and that promise was his fuel. The way was hard. The vegetation ripped its already injured skin, and the insects gathered in clouds around it, attracted by the smell of sweat and blood. But Gordon wouldn't let himself down. With each step, he was closer to his goal, a life where he could finally breathe without fear. At dawn, he reached the limit of the swamps. In front of him, there was a vastness of fields, still hidden by the morning mist. He knew he needed to be fast, that the day would bring him new dangers, but he also knew he was close. The distant sound of voices and horse hooves made him stop for a moment. Soldiers. Gordon's heart accelerated even more, but this time it was not the fear that guided him, but hope. Gathering his last strength, Gordon ran. Every fiber of his body protested, but he did not give up. He could not give up. The voices became clearer, and soon he could see the silhouettes of men in blue uniform, the soldiers of the Union. The vision was almost surreal. For Gordon, those men were not just soldiers. They were the promise of a new life. When he finally reached them, Gordon fell to his knees, his body exhausted and covered with mud and blood. The soldiers surrounded him, but contrary to what he expected, there were no screams, there were no threats. Instead, extended hands helped him get up, and for the first time, Gordon was treated as an equal, a free man. Words were not necessary. The soldiers saw the scars on their backs, each telling a story of suffering and resistance. Gordon knew he was safe, that he had finally crossed the line between being property and being a human being. The feeling was overwhelming, as if a ton of invisible currents had been removed from his shoulders. There, among men who fought for freedom and equality, Gordon found a temporary home. The soldiers took care of their wounds, gave him clean food and clothes. For the first time, he slept without fear of being awakened by a whip or a cruel order. The photo they took from their backs, with scars that looked more like rivers of pain, would soon become an icon of resistance. Gordon, now a free man, continued his struggle, no longer for survival, but for justice. The war still roared around, but he knew he didn't fight alone. The image of his marked backs, his desperate escape, would be a powerful reminder that freedom, though late and painful, was possible. And so, he would become a legend, a living testimony that hope and courage can break the heavier currents. Gordon's body was sitting on a rudimentary bench, carried out rushed to gross wood, while the photographer adjusted the precarious lighting of a small makeshift room. The sunlight, filtered through a dusty window, cast gentle shadows on the aged wood walls, creating an almost poetic contrast between the brightness that entered and the darkness that still persisted in Gordon's memories. The smell of chemicals used in the photographic process was mixed with the aroma of the damp earth and dry sweat that pervaded the environment, creating a heavy and dense atmosphere. Gordon remained immovable, the fixed look at some point on the horizon that only he could see. Each scar on his back was a narrative in himself, a line of a horror tale he could never forget. The texture of his skin, marked by deep and irregular grooves, was a silent testimony of his suffering. For those who observed, those scars were more than mere signs of torture. They were a statement of resistance, brutal evidence of the resilience of a man who had refused to be subdued. The photographer, a middle-aged man named Matthew Mampson, had seen his dimension of horrors during the war. Still, looking at Gordon's back, he felt cold through his spine. He knew that photo would not just be an image. It would be a silent cry that would cross time and space, reaching hearts and minds in a cry for justice. Matthew positioned the camera, adjusting every detail with the accuracy of a surgeon. He understood the importance of that moment and the responsibility he carried in his hands. With an almost inaudible click, the image was captured. The record was more than a portrait. It was a mirror of Gordon's soul, reflecting the pain and hope that coexisted in his chest. The photo, in black and white, accentuated each line and curve of the scars, transforming the marked meat into a work of morbid but deeply moving art. The light and shadow played with the marks, creating a map that told stories of pain and resistance. As the image was slowly revealed before Matthew's eyes, Gordon remained silent, absorbed in his thoughts. He remembered every blow, every pain, but also the nights he had dreamed of freedom, when he had to believe that one day it would be more than a simple number in the inventory of a plantation. The photo was not just a testimony of his past, but a promise of a future where he could fight, no longer for survival, but for justice. The image of his back, marked by scars that looked more like rivers of suffering, would soon be reproduced and distributed, shocking the world with the brutality it represented. It would become a powerful symbol, a catalyst that would ignite the abolitionist movement and arouse asleep consciences. Gordon's scars, though ugly and painful, were also beautiful in their resistance, a reminder that even in the deeper darkness, light can infiltrate. Matthew, seeing the final photograph, felt a twinge of pride mixed with sadness. He knew that the image would not only capture Gordon's pain, but also his strength and dignity. It was a reminder that freedom and justice were arduous achievements, achieved through unthinkable sacrifices. Gordon's photo was not just a portrait of pain. It was a manifesto of resistance, a statement that humanity cannot be silenced, even in the face of the worst atrocities. Thus, Gordon's image, with his scars exposed to the world, has become a lighthouse of hope, a constant reminder that freedom, though late, is an inalienable right. And while the world reacted to the photo, Gordon continued his fight, now no longer lonely, but with the conviction that his story, although painful, could inspire a change in the cruel gears of a society that finally began to open his eyes to the perpetuating brutality. The characteristic sound of the roll being brushed in the newsrooms and houses of those who could afford to buy a newspaper. It was the year 1863, and the world was immersed in social and political seizures. In the United States, the Civil War cracked the country in half, and the issue of slavery was the core of a conflict that threatened to destroy the nation. However, beyond the trenches and battlefields, another silent war gained strength, the struggle for freedom and human dignity. It was in this context that Gordon's photo, his scars marked by scars, began to circulate. Initially published in a New York abolitionist newspaper, the image quickly spread as fire in dry straw. Matthew Thompson, the photographer who captured the portrait, knew that his work had the power to transcend words, to touch the souls of those who saw it. He was not wrong. As soon as the photo was released, she caused a wave of shock and indignation that did not respect borders. Each mark in Gordon's skin told a story, and these stories now shouted to an audience that could no longer ignore the brutal reality of slavery. The photo had become an irrefutable proof of black cruelty, a visual testimony that challenged the justifications of those who still defended the slave system. The scars, like dry rivers of tears and blood, were a silent but powerful accusation. In northern cities, such as Boston and Philadelphia, abolitionists quickly recognized the potential of that image. Meetings were summoned, leaflets were printed, and inflamed speeches were given in halls and streets. Gordon's photo was displayed as a flag, a standard that asked for immediate action. "See what they do," the speakers proclaimed, pointing to the image. "This is the price of our indifference." The reaction was not limited to the north of the United States. The photo crossed the Atlantic, reaching the hands of abolitionists in England and other European countries. In Britain, where slavery had already been abolished, the public was horrified by realizing that practice still flourished across the ocean. Articles were written in respected newspapers, letters were sent to the government, and international pressure on Confederated states increased every day. However, the photo not only exposed the brutality of slavery, she also humanized those who were seen as mere properties. Gordon, with his eyes determined and his scars on display, became the face of a struggle that could no longer be ignored. He was a symbol of resistance, of a man who had challenged all the odds to claim his freedom. His image inspired those who were still chained, whispering to them that freedom was painful but possible. In the southern states, the reaction was denial and anger. The pro-slavery newspapers tried to describe the image, calling it abolitionist propaganda or farce. However, the truth had already been revealed and could not be contained. While the defenders of slavery were trying to maintain the status quo, Gordon's photo continued his journey, penetrating minds and hearts that were once indifferent. In the plantations, the news of that photo and its impact began to circulate among the enslaved, subtly passed from hand to hand, mouth to mouth. Hope, which had so often crushed, was now beginning to rekindle. Gordon, unknowingly, had become a hero for many, his story a lighthouse in the darkness. He had shown that freedom was worth any sacrifice, that the desire to be treated as human was an inextinguishable impulse. While the powerful tried to minimize the impact of the image, the reality was that Gordon's photo had already fulfilled its role. She had torn the veil of ignorance and apathy that covered society, exposing the purulent wound that was slavery. It was a living proof that, even at the darker moments, the truth found a way to emerge, to shine through cracks like the sunlight through a dirty window. Gordon's journey was not over. War continued, and the struggle for the abolition of slavery would require more blood and sacrifice. But Gordon's photo had planted seeds of change, and these seeds began to sprout. Amid chaos and destruction, the image of his scars was a constant memory that freedom was not just an abstract idea, but an urgent need, a promise that needed to be fulfilled. Thus, as the world reacted and changed, Gordon continued his struggle, no longer alone, but accompanied by millions who, inspired by his courage, were willing to fight for a future where everyone could live free. The photo that shocked the world had become a catalyst of change, proof that resistance was possible and that justice, though late, was inevitable. The sound of typographic presses roared as an industrial thunder, spewing out copies after copies of newspapers that would witness the horror on Gordon's photo. That image, a certificate of pain and resistance, ran the cities with the speed of an incendiary rumor, entangling in people's conversations as an invisible serpent. It was the year 1863, a time when the American Civil War had already reaped thousands of lives, but the true battle for the nation's soul was just beginning to unfold in the hearts and minds of its citizens. In the northern cities, people gathered in squares and crowded halls, the fixed eyes on Gordon's scars, whose tortured lines told a story that could no longer be ignored. Abolitionist meetings, previously limited to a fervent but restricted audience, now overflowed with new faces, inflamed by what they had seen. Passionate speakers climbed the improvised stages, their voices echoing along the walls, reverberating the pillars of a society that was beginning to question their own foundations. "Look at these brands!" they vehemently exclaimed, pointing to the expanded image that hung from a wall. "Each line is a scream of suffocated freedom, every scar a barbarism proof that we tolerate too long." The words, loaded with emotion and truth, penetrated deep, like arrows fired toward the hearts of the ordinary people who had until then stayed on the fringes of this moral conflict. Young people who had never been involved in political issues now shaking flags, their faces hardened by determination. Women who had been relegated to domestic roles raised their voices in resistance songs, composing hymns that echoed the streets. Gordon's image had become a symbol, a living proof that the struggle for abolition was not just a political issue, but a moral obligation. It was a brutal reminder that freedom could not be conquered without pain and sacrifice. Meanwhile, in the corridors of power, Gordon's photo was a warning to those who still hesitated in tone air a clear position. In the White House, Abraham Lincoln, already deeply involved in the struggle for the preservation of the Union, saw in the photo a powerful instrument of propaganda. He knew that the image could galvanize public opinion, helping to justify war not only as an effort to keep the country together, but as a moral crusade against injustice and inhumanity. The War Department quickly realized the potential of the image as a recruitment tool. Pamphlets were printed, with Gordon's photo alongside slogans who appealed directly to the sense of justice and duty of the citizens. "Fight for freedom" and "End with tyranny." It was the cries that accompanied the image, turning it into a catalyst of action. Young men, inspired by the vision of scars, enlisted in mass, determined to fight a system that allowed such cruelty. In addition to the U.S. borders, Gordon's photo echoed as a distant thunder, resonating on lands where slavery had already been abolished. In England, the image circulated between intellectual and political circles, causing heated debates about the role that the country should play in the American crisis. Letters sent to the newspaper editors cried for a firmer intervention, while activists pressured the government to adopt a more critical stance compared to Confederated states. The reaction of the Southern states, on the other hand, was of denial and indignation. The photo was rejected as a forgery, a Northern propaganda designed to destroy its form of life. However, even among those who tried to discredit the image, there was a growing restlessness, a palpable fear that the world was finally waking up to the injustice of his cause. Within the opulent mansions and cotton fields, rumors about Gordon's photo were beginning to spread among the enslaved, offering a spark of hope amid despair. For those who still lived under the yoke of servitude, the image was a lighthouse in darkness, proof that resistance was not only possible, but it was happening at that very moment. The stories of Gordon, his escape, and scars were whispered in low but determined voices, inflammating the desire for freedom where there was only resignation before. Gordon's photo, more than a mere portrait, had become a powerful weapon in the battle for abolition. She exposed the naked and raw truth, forcing a nation to confront the moral abyss in which she had fallen. And while the flames of civil war continued to consume the country, the image of their scars remained engraved in collective conscience, a constant reminder that the struggle for freedom and justice was a battle that was worth being fought, even against all probabilities. The sound of leather boots hitting the dirt floor reverberated in Gordon's mind as a constant reminder of his new reality. After escaping the brutality of the plantations, Gordon found a new purpose by stating in the Union Army, determined to fight those who had kept him chained. The Army was not just a refuge, it was his chance of revenge, his opportunity to retaliate against a system that had subjugated him for years. Gordon was among the thousands of black men who enlisted, their hearts inflamed by the desire for freedom and justice. Civil War offered a unique platform to transform their lives from mere survivors to soldiers of a larger cause. The tent where he now rests was a simple structure, but it represented a security that he had never known before. The smell of gunpowder and sweat impregnated the air, a familiar mixture that reconnecting him to the fights that were yet to come. The training was hard. Each day he began to the shrill sound of a whistle, calling the soldiers to exercises that tested not only their physical resistance, but also their determination. Gordon, with his visible scars even under the uniform, was a living memory of what was at stake. He stood out not only for his strength, but for his ferocity with each exercise, with each maneuver. His platoon companions saw not only a leader, but a symbol of resistance. Gradually, Gordon adapted to military life. He learned to manage weapons accurately, his calloused hands finding comfort in the weight of a rifle. He learned the formations, the tactics, and, most importantly, learned to trust his brothers with arms, men who, like him, had suffered under the yoke of slavery. Together they formed a fierce unity, driven by a common desire to see the end of oppression. However, the battlefield was a cruel place, where death lurked around every corner. Gordon faced his first hard combat in his throat but did not hesitate. The deafening sound of cannons, the scream of the wounded, and the smell of fresh blood became their new companions. He fought with the same determination that he had guided him on his escape. Each shot fired a memory of each whip received. Over the months, Gordon became more than a soldier. He became a legend among his peers. His courage under fire, his ability in desperate situations, became stories told around the camps of the camp. But as he stood out, the weight of the lost lives around him did not escape his conscience. The war charged its price, and Gordon felt every death as a wound in his soul. In one of the most brutal clashes, during an offensive in enemy territory, Gordon found himself face to face with Thomas Richardson, the foreman who had so often whipped him. The recognition was instantaneous, and the anger Gordon felt was almost palpable. At that moment, he was not just a soldier, he was the avenger, a man finally face to face with his tormentor. The battle that followed was intense and personal. Gordon, moved by years of pain and humiliation, faced Thomas with the fury of a man determined to correct the injustices of the past. Each scam exchanged was a release, each movement one step toward the freedom he had longed for. In the end, Thomas fell, defeated not only physically but also morally by a man he had ever judged inferior. With the victory over Thomas, Gordon felt a weight being raised from his shoulders. He had not only avenged himself, but also to all those who had suffered under the cruelty of forecasts like Thomas. This personal victory was a reaffirmation of its purpose, a reminder that the struggle for freedom was a battle that was worth being fought. While the war continued, Gordon remained firm, his determination unbreakable. He fought not only for himself, but for a future where no one else would have to endure what he had endured. Gordon's transformation from slave to soldier was a testimony of his resilience, a reminder that freedom, though painful and late, was a destination he was determined to achieve. Thus, amid the chaos of the Civil War, Gordon found his true voice, no longer muffled by shackles or whips, but strong and clear, crying out for justice. He was not just a soldier, it was a symbol of resistance, a living proof that courage and determination can break even the heaviest currents. And as he marched beside his companions, Gordon knew that each step took him not only to battle, but to a future where he and so many others could finally be free. The sound of steps echoed through the corridors of a well-lit museum, where Gordon's photo was on permanent exhibition. The image, a central piece in a room dedicated to the horrors of slavery, was more than a simple representation of physical scars. It was a mirror that reflected the wounds of a nation. The walls around were adorned with historical documents, letters, and reports that contextualized the brutality of a system that had marked the history of the United States indelibly. For many visitors, Gordon's image was a reality shock. The deep lines on his back, captured with almost cruel accuracy, served as a silent testimony of the pain and resistance of millions of souls that had been subjugated. The soft light that bathed the room seemed to highlight the scars even more, as if each of them whispered stories of suffering and courage. The light smell of aged paper and fresh paint hovered in the air, creating an atmosphere that invited reflection. Students, historians, and onlookers from all over the world came to see Gordon's image, each seeking to understand a little more about the complexities of a past that still cast their shadows about the present. For many, it was the first time they had seen what they had only read in history books before. The impact was immediate and deep. The reactions varied from contemplative silence to inevitable tears, while each visitor tried to process the magnitude of what was before his eyes. Gordon's photo, with his scars on display, was not just a graphic representation of cruelty, It was an eternal accusation against slavery and its ramifications. Over the decades, the image has fueled heated debates on justice, equality, and human rights. It became a starting point for discussions that went beyond the U.S. borders, reaching nations where slavery had left similar scars. In seminars and conferences, the image was often displayed as a reminder of the past that should not be repeated. In the United States, Gordon's photo helped shape the movement by civil rights that would gain strength in the 20th century. Leaders like Martin Luther King Jr. and Rosa Parks often evoked Gordon's image to illustrate the long J ornament towards freedom and equality. Photography had become a symbol of resistance, proof that even in the face of the most terrible adversities, human dignity cannot be destroyed. Each line on its back was a line in history, a brand that remembered everyone that the struggle for justice and equality was continuous. Gordon's image also had a deep impact on the field of arts. Painters, sculptors, and writers found inspiration in the scars that told a story of pain and resilience. Works of art were created in his honor, each one uniquely capturing the essence of his struggle. In galleries and exhibitions, Gordon's image was celebrated not only as a symbol of resistance, but as a testimony of the human ability to overcome oppression. In addition to its cultural and social impact, Gordon's photo played a crucial role in education. In classrooms around the world, teachers used the image to teach about the history of slavery and its lasting effects. Photography was a powerful tool for inciting empathy and understanding, allowing new generations to see the past in a way that books and words on their own could not convey. Gordon's scars were a tangible reminder of what it means to fight for freedom, and his image encouraged students to become advocates of justice and equality. Over the years, Gordon's photo continued to reverberate through generations, remaining relevant in a world that still fought against inequalities. In protests and manifestations, his image was often raised as a flag, a symbol that the struggle for freedom and justice was not over. Gordon's photography was a reminder that despite the advances, there was still much to be done, and that each individual had a role to play in building a fairer world. The legacy of Gordon's image is a testimony of the ability of a single photography to change consciousness and inspire actions. It transcended time and space, becoming an indelible part of world history. The scars that were once seen as marks of pain have become symbols of strength and resistance, reminding everyone that freedom is an inalienable right that must be protected and defended at any cost. Thus, while Gordon's photo is still displayed in museums and galleries, his message remains clear and powerful. She reminds us that, however deep, the scars of injustice, the struggle for freedom and human dignity is a battle that should never cease. And as long as future generations meet to contemplate Gordon's image, they will be inspired to continue the struggle for a world where everyone can live free and equal.